Welcome to a journey into one of the darkest corridors of the 20th century Nazi Germany, where fear was not only felt, but engineered. In 1933, as Adolf Hitler rose to power, a secret police force known as the Gestapo emerged from the shadows, becoming an instrument of surveillance, intimidation, and terror. Neighbors informed on neighbors, whispers became evidence, and a knock at the door after midnight could mean disappearance without trial. Under figures such as Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, the Gestapo expanded its reach across Germany and occupied Europe, turning suspicion into policy and obedience into survival. This video invites you to step behind the propaganda posters and marching parades to witness the machinery of control that operated in silence. Through hidden files, coded messages, and chilling testimonies, we explore how ordinary streets became landscapes of fear and how history remembers those who endured it. On the evening of the 27th of February, 1933, flames engulfed the Reichstag building in Berlin, casting an orange glow across the heart of the German capital. As firefighters battled the blaze that consumed the parliament's iconic glass dome, Adolf Hitler stood watching alongside his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. "This is a God-given signal," Hitler reportedly declared. "If this fire, as I believe, turns out to be the handiwork of communists, then there is nothing that shall stop us now from crushing out this murderous pest with an iron fist." Within hours, a young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene. Within days, the Nazi regime had used the incident to justify the most sweeping suspension of civil liberties in German history. And within weeks, an organization would be born that would transform political paranoia into industrialized terror, the Geheime Staatspolizei, known to history by its chilling abbreviation, the Gestapo. To understand how such an institution could emerge, one must first journey back to the turbulent years that preceded Hitler's rise. The Germany that emerged from World War I was a nation traumatized, humiliated, and fractured. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped away territory, imposed crushing reparations, and placed sole blame for the war on German shoulders. Kaiser Wilhelm II had fled into exile, and in his place arose the Weimar Republic, a democratic experiment born in defeat and haunted by instability from its first breath. Between 1919 and 1933, Germany cycled through 20 different governments. Street battles between communist and nationalist paramilitaries became commonplace. Hyperinflation in 1923 rendered the currency worthless, with workers famously needing wheelbarrows of banknotes to purchase a loaf of bread. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, unemployment soared to 6 million, and faith in democratic institutions collapsed alongside the economy. It was into this chaos that the National Socialist German Workers' Party inserted itself, promising order, national renewal, and revenge against those it blamed for Germany's suffering communists, Jews, and the democratic politicians who had allegedly stabbed the nation in the back. When Hitler was appointed Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, he inherited not just a desperate nation, but also a fragmented system of police forces divided among Germany's various states. The Nazis understood immediately that consolidating control over these forces would be essential to their grip on power. The task of creating a centralized political police in Prussia, Germany's largest state, fell to Hermann Göring. A World War I flying ace with a flamboyant personality and ruthless ambition, Göring had been appointed Prussian Minister of the Interior just days after Hitler became Chancellor. He moved with remarkable speed. On the 26th of April 1933, Göring issued a decree establishing the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, by reorganizing the political police department that had existed under the Weimar Republic. The new organization was headquartered at Prinz Albrecht Straße, 8 inches Berlin, an address that would soon become synonymous with terror. The building's basement would be converted into interrogation cells, where countless victims would suffer in the years to come. Goering initially envisioned the Gestapo as his personal instrument of power, a tool to eliminate enemies and expand his influence within the Nazi hierarchy. He recruited heavily from existing police forces, bringing in professional detectives alongside committed Nazis. Rudolf Diels, a career police official who had served under the Weimar Republic, became the organization's first director. Diels was an opportunist rather than an ideological fanatic, but he understood what his new masters required and proved willing to provide it. Under his leadership, the Gestapo quickly expanded from a few hundred officers to several thousand, spreading its reach across Prussia and beginning the systematic compilation of files on potential enemies of the state. The Reichstag fire decree, issued by President Paul von Hindenburg on February 28, 1933. Just one day after the flames consumed, the Parliament provided the legal foundation for the Gestapo's operations. This emergency decree suspended fundamental civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right of assembly, and the privacy of postal and telephone communications. Most crucially, it permitted protective custody, the power to imprison individuals indefinitely without charge, trial, or judicial review. What was presented as a temporary emergency measure would remain in effect for the entire duration of the Third Reich, providing a veneer of legality to arbitrary detention and state-sponsored kidnapping. The Nazi regime moved quickly to eliminate all political opposition through this newly acquired power. In the weeks following the Reichstag fire, the Gestapo and SA brownshirts swept through working-class neighborhoods, arresting Communist Party officials, trade union leaders, and social democratic politicians by the thousands. The raids were systematic and brutal. Ernst Thälmann, leader of the Communist Party of Germany, was arrested on the 3rd of March 1933 and would spend the next 11 years in solitary confinement before being executed at Buchenwald in 1944. His fate exemplified what awaited those deemed enemies of the new order. The suppression of trade unions followed in May 1933, coordinated with characteristic Nazi theatricality. May 1, traditionally a day of labor celebration, was declared a national holiday by the regime, a gesture designed to win workers' support. The following day, SA and Gestapo units stormed union offices across Germany, seizing assets, arresting leaders, and dissolving organizations that had represented millions of workers. Theodor Leipart, chairman of the General German Trade Union Federation, was taken into custody along with hundreds of other union officials. Within weeks, independent labor organizations had ceased to exist, replaced by the regime-controlled German Labor Front. The speed and efficiency of this operation demonstrated both the Gestapo's growing capabilities and the regime's utter ruthlessness in eliminating potential sources of opposition. The early concentration camps that emerged in 1933 served as extensions of Gestapo power. Dachau, established near Munich in March 1933 under the authority of Heinrich Himmler, then police president of Munich, became the prototype for the camp system. The Gestapo determined who would be sent to such facilities through its power of protective custody, creating a pipeline of political prisoners that operated entirely outside the traditional justice system. Guards at these early camps, drawn primarily from the SA and later the SS, subjected prisoners to systematic brutality that established patterns of abuse that would intensify catastrophically in the years ahead. The transformation of the Gestapo from Goering's personal instrument into a component of a larger SS empire began in 1934 and culminated in 1936. Heinrich Himmler, the bespectacled former chicken farmer who had transformed the SS from a small bodyguard unit into a powerful organization, recognized that controlling the political police was essential to his ambitions. Through patient maneuvering and the support of Hitler, Himmler gradually extended his authority over police forces throughout Germany. On the 20th of April, 1934, Hitler's birthday, a date chosen with deliberate symbolism, Goering transferred control of the Gestapo to Himmler. Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's ruthlessly ambitious deputy, was appointed to direct day-to-day operations. Under Himmler and Heydrich, the Gestapo became simultaneously more professional and more deadly. Heydrich, a former naval officer who had been dismissed from the service under murky circumstances, brought organizational genius to the task of building a terror apparatus. He merged the Gestapo with the security service of the SS, creating an intelligence network that combined police powers with ideological surveillance. The recruitment of personnel shifted to emphasize younger, more ideologically committed officers, though many career policemen who had joined under deals remained in positions of authority. The internal culture of the organization increasingly reflected SS values, obedience, racial consciousness, and absolute loyalty to the Führer. The legal framework supporting Gestapo operations was formalized through a series of decrees and court decisions that effectively placed the organization above the law. A Prussian administrative court ruled in 1935 that Gestapo actions were not subject to judicial review, establishing the principle that the secret police operated in a realm beyond legal accountability. Werner Best, the legal theorist who would later become Heydrich's deputy, articulated the doctrine that the Gestapo was bound only by the will of the leadership, not by any external legal constraints. As long as the police carries out the will of the leadership, Best wrote, it is acting legally. This circular reasoning that legality derived from obedience to authority rather than from established law represented a fundamental perversion of the rule of law that enabled all subsequent atrocities. By 1936, the Gestapo had established the surveillance methods that would characterize its operations throughout the Third Reich. Every block in urban neighborhoods had its warden, tasked with monitoring residents and reporting suspicious activities. Informants were recruited from all walks of life, concierges who tracked visitors, co-workers who reported conversations, even family members who denounced relatives. The organization maintained elaborate filing systems cataloging potential enemies by category: political opponents, racial undesirables, religious dissenters, homosexuals, and anyone else deemed threatening to the Nazi vision of society. The files at Prince Albrechtstrasse grew to encompass millions of names, a bureaucracy of suspicion that gave the Gestapo the appearance of omniscience. The interrogation techniques developed during these early years established protocols of cruelty that would only intensify with time. Suspects brought to Gestapo headquarters or regional offices faced physical and psychological torture designed to extract confessions and identify accomplices. Sleep deprivation, beatings, and the threat of indefinite detention in concentration camps broke the resistance of countless prisoners. Those who survived these ordeals often emerged with permanent physical and psychological damage. Those who did not survive simply disappeared, their fates unknown to families left in agonizing uncertainty. The year 1936 represented a watershed moment in the Gestapo's institutional development. On June 17, Himmler was appointed Chief of German Police, unifying all police forces under his authority and effectively merging them with the SS. The Gestapo became part of the newly created security police, alongside the criminal police, with Heydrich commanding both. This reorganization completed the transformation of German policing from a system nominally bound by law into an instrument of ideological warfare. The professional detectives who had once investigated crimes according to established procedures now served an organization whose purpose was not justice but domination. The Olympic Games held in Berlin that August provided a peculiar interlude in this trajectory of terror. The regime temporarily softened its most visible persecutions to present a benign face to international visitors, even removing some anti-Jewish signs from public view. The Gestapo increased its surveillance activities during the Games, monitoring foreign journalists and athletes for signs of anti-Nazi sentiment while maintaining a lower profile than usual. It was a demonstration of the organization's flexibility, capable of intense violence when required, but also capable of strategic restraint when the regime's interests demanded a different approach. In the spring of 1936, a Berlin housewife named Ilse Sonja Totzke made a decision that would seal her fate. During a conversation with a neighbor in her apartment building, she expressed doubt about the Nazi regime and questioned whether Germany was truly headed toward a brighter future. Within days, the Gestapo arrived at her door. Her neighbor, a woman she had considered a friend, had filed a detailed denunciation. Totzke was arrested, interrogated, and eventually sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Her crime was nothing more than speaking her mind in what she believed was a private conversation. Her story, preserved in Gestapo files that survived the war, illustrates a profound truth about how the Nazi terror state actually functioned. The Gestapo's power derived not primarily from its own agents, but from the willingness of ordinary Germans to inform upon one another. This was the dark genius of the system. It transformed an entire society into both prisoners and guards, watched and watchers, creating a web of fear that penetrated into the most intimate corners of daily life. The popular image of the Gestapo as an omniscient organization with agents on every corner is largely a myth, though it was a myth the organization cultivated deliberately. In reality, the Gestapo was surprisingly small. At its peak, the organization employed approximately 32,000 personnel to police a population of over 66 million within Germany's 1,939 borders, a ratio of roughly one Gestapo officer for every 2,000 citizens. In the city of Düsseldorf, for example, a mere 281 Gestapo officers monitored a population of 500,000 people. Würzburg, a city of approximately 65,000, was policed by just 28 Gestapo agents. These numbers made comprehensive surveillance through direct observation physically impossible. The solution was to deputize the population itself as the Gestapo's eyes and ears. The denunciation system that emerged represented one of history's most effective mechanisms of social control. Historian Robert Gellertli, examining surviving Gestapo files from Würzburg and other cities, discovered that the majority of cases began not with Gestapo investigations, but with voluntary denunciations from ordinary citizens. Neighbors reported neighbors. Workers informed on colleagues. Family members betrayed relatives. The motivations were as varied as the denouncers themselves: genuine ideological commitment, personal grudges, professional jealousy, desire for a neighbor's apartment, romantic rivalries, and simple malice all played their roles. The Gestapo needed only to process the flood of information that arrived unbidden at their offices. The regime actively encouraged this culture of surveillance through propaganda and institutional mechanisms. Block wardens appointed by the Nazi Party monitored the inhabitants of their assigned buildings, tracking who came and went, who listened to foreign radio broadcasts, who failed to display the swastika flag on appropriate occasions. These wardens were not Gestapo employees but ordinary citizens granted minor authority, yet their presence ensured that apartment buildings and neighborhoods became spaces of constant observation. The Hitler Youth Organization trained children to place loyalty to the state above loyalty to family, creating an environment in which parents feared expressing dissent even within their own homes. The Führer is always right, children were taught, and some took this lesson to its logical extreme by reporting their parents' private conversations to teachers or youth group leaders. The system's efficiency at generating information created challenges of its own. Gestapo offices were frequently overwhelmed by the volume of denunciations, many of which proved to be baseless accusations motivated by personal vendettas. Officers developed protocols for sorting credible reports from obvious fabrications, though the threshold for action remained terrifyingly low. A complaint about defeatist comments might be dismissed if the accused was a well-connected party member, but the same complaint against someone already on Gestapo watch lists could trigger immediate arrest. This arbitrariness was itself a tool of control. No one could be certain which casual remark might bring the secret police to their door, so the safest course was silence. When the Gestapo did come for someone, the experience was designed to maximize terror and disorientation. Arrests typically occurred in the early morning hours or late at night, when targets were most vulnerable and witnesses fewest. The knock at the door, or more often, the pounding, announced an encounter from which many would never return. Officers provided no explanations, showed no warrants, and answered no questions. Suspects were simply taken, leaving families in agonizing uncertainty about where their loved ones had been brought and what fate awaited them. The interrogation methods employed at Gestapo headquarters and regional offices combined bureaucratic procedure with systematic brutality. Suspects were first subjected to detailed questioning about their backgrounds, associations, and activities. Interrogators worked from files that often contained information from multiple denunciations and surveillance reports, allowing them to catch suspects in contradictions and create the impression of near-total knowledge. The psychological pressure of facing an interrogator who seemed to know everything about one's life broke many prisoners before physical methods were even employed. For those who resisted or whose cases were deemed sufficiently serious, the Gestapo employed an array of torture techniques refined over years of practice. The standing cell, in which prisoners were confined in spaces too small to sit or lie down, produced excruciating pain and exhaustion over hours or days. Beatings were routine, administered with fists, rubber truncheons, or whatever implements were at hand. More specialized techniques included the rack, in which prisoners were suspended by their wrists tied behind their backs, dislocating shoulders and causing permanent nerve damage. Water torture, electrical shocks, and crushing of fingers and toes were documented in survivor testimonies and post-war investigations. The infamous basement cells of Prinz Albrechtstrasse, 8 inches Berlin, the Gestapo's headquarters, became known as places where human beings entered and broken shells emerged, if they emerged at all. The purpose of torture extended beyond extracting information, though that remained an important objective. Torture served to demonstrate the absolute power of the state over the individual body, breaking not just physical resistance but the psychological capacity for defiance. Survivors frequently described feeling utterly dehumanized by their experiences, reduced to animals concerned only with avoiding the next blow. This destruction of human dignity was deliberate policy. A broken prisoner released back into society served as a walking advertisement for the consequences of opposition, their visible injuries and haunted demeanor, communicating what words could not about the price of resistance. For many prisoners, Gestapo custody was merely the first station on a journey that ended in concentration camps. The relationship between the Gestapo and the camp system was symbiotic. The Gestapo determined who would be sent to the camps through its power of protective custody, while the camps provided a destination that made the threat of Gestapo arrest genuinely terrifying. Unlike prisons administered by the justice system, concentration camps operated entirely outside legal oversight. There were no trials, no sentences, no release dates. Prisoners could be held indefinitely, worked to death, or murdered outright, and their families might never learn what had happened to them. The early camps, established in 1933 and 1934, including Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald, were initially populated primarily by political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and trade unionists whom the regime considered threats. The Gestapo maintained detailed records of these prisoners, tracking their behavior in custody and determining when, if ever, they might be released. Some prisoners were indeed freed after months or years of detention, returning to society as broken reminders of the cost of opposition. Others disappeared forever, killed by guards, worked to death, or transferred to the extermination apparatus that would develop during the war years. The suppression of resistance movements became one of the Gestapo's primary functions, and here the organization demonstrated both its capabilities and its limitations. Communist underground networks, maintained by party members who had avoided the initial waves of arrests, proved remarkably resilient despite continuous Gestapo pressure. The organization responded with patient infiltration, inserting agents and informants into resistance circles and waiting for them to identify the network's extent before striking. The Red Orchestra, a Soviet-linked resistance network that operated within Germany during the war, was eventually penetrated and destroyed through such methods, with over 130 members arrested and many executed. Religious groups presented particular challenges for the Gestapo, as their networks were often deeply embedded in community life and their members motivated by convictions that proved resistant to intimidation. The Confessing Church, a Protestant movement that opposed Nazi interference in religious affairs, found itself under constant Gestapo surveillance. Its leader, Pastor Martin Niemöller, was arrested in 1937 and spent the next 8 years in concentration camps. His famous post-war reflection, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist," emerged directly from his experience of watching the Gestapo systematically eliminate one group after another, while the majority remained silent. Jehovah's Witnesses faced particularly brutal persecution, as their religious beliefs forbade participation in military service or Nazi ceremonies. The Gestapo arrested approximately 10,000 German witnesses during the Nazi period, and between 2000 and 2,500 were sent to concentration camps, where they were identified by purple triangles on their uniforms. Unlike many other prisoner categories, witnesses were often offered freedom if they would simply sign a declaration renouncing their faith. The vast majority refused, a testament to the limits of terror when confronted with genuine conviction. Their resistance infuriated Gestapo officials accustomed to breaking prisoners through psychological and physical pressure. The Catholic Church, too powerful to suppress outright, nevertheless found its institutions under continuous Gestapo scrutiny. Priests who spoke against the regime from the pulpit were arrested and sent to camps. Religious schools were closed. Youth organizations were dissolved. The Gestapo monitored sermons, interrogated clergy, and maintained files on bishops and cardinals suspected of opposition. The murder of disabled persons through the T4 euthanasia program prompted rare public protests from Catholic bishops, most notably Clemens August Graf von Galen of Münster, whose 1,941 sermons denouncing the killings circulated widely. The regime temporarily halted the official program in response. Though killings continued covertly, a rare instance in which public pressure forced the Nazi state to modify its behavior. The persecution of minorities, particularly Jews, represented the Gestapo's most systematic and ultimately murderous function. From 1933 onward, the Gestapo compiled detailed records of Jewish citizens, tracking their property, their movements, and their attempts to emigrate. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 provided a legal framework for persecution, and the Gestapo enforced their provisions with characteristic thoroughness. Jewish businesses were monitored and ultimately expropriated. Mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews were investigated, and those involved pressured to divorce. Any contact between Jews and the broader German population that exceeded the permitted minimum attracted Gestapo attention. The November pogrom of 1938, known euphemistically as Kristallnacht, demonstrated the coordination between the Gestapo and the broader apparatus of persecution. While SA paramilitaries and ordinary citizens destroyed synagogues and Jewish businesses across Germany, the Gestapo systematically arrested approximately 30,000 Jewish men and transported them to concentration camps. The arrests followed prepared lists, revealing the extent of prior surveillance and planning. This was not spontaneous violence but orchestrated terror, with the Gestapo playing its designated role in a carefully choreographed catastrophe. The psychological dimensions of Gestapo terror extended far beyond those directly targeted for arrest and persecution. The organization perfected techniques of intimidation that affected entire communities. The practice of summoning individuals for discussions at Gestapo headquarters, even when no arrest followed, spread fear and uncertainty. Those summoned never knew if they would return home, and their neighbors could only speculate about what the encounter signified. Family members of arrested persons faced systematic pressure. Wives were encouraged to divorce, imprisoned husbands, parents were urged to disown children, and employment opportunities disappeared for anyone associated with a political case. This extension of consequences to family members served both to isolate prisoners from support networks and to discourage others from risking similar fates. The Night and Fog Decree, issued by Hitler in December 1941, formalized one of the Gestapo's most terrifying practices: the disappearance of prisoners without trace. Under this directive, resistance fighters and others arrested in occupied territories were transported to Germany and held in conditions of complete secrecy. Their families received no notification of arrest, no information about their location, and no news of their fate. The uncertainty was deliberate, intended to maximize the psychological impact on populations under German occupation. Efficient and enduring intimidation can only be achieved either by capital punishment or by measures by which the relatives of the criminal and the population do not know the fate of the criminal, the decree explained with chilling bureaucratic clarity. Thousands vanished into this fog, their fates unknown to families who waited years for loved ones who would never return. The legal immunity under which the Gestapo operated enabled all of these atrocities. A 1936 decree explicitly exempted Gestapo actions from judicial review, establishing the principle that courts had no authority to examine or question the organization's activities. This immunity was not merely theoretical, it was enforced in practice. When brave judges or prosecutors attempted to investigate Gestapo actions, they were quickly removed from their positions or pressured into silence. The few attorneys who dared to represent victims of Gestapo persecution found their own careers endangered. The message was clear: the Gestapo stood above the law, answerable only to the Nazi leadership and ultimately to the Führer himself. As the winter of 1943 gave way to spring, something imperceptible yet profound began shifting within the corridors of power in Nazi Germany. The Gestapo, that omnipresent spectre that had held millions in its grip of fear for a decade, was beginning to feel the first tremors of its eventual collapse. What had once seemed an invincible apparatus of state terror would, within 2 years, lie in ruins alongside the Reich it had served. But the story of its decline is not merely one of military defeat, it is a tale of desperate men attempting to erase their crimes, of justice imperfectly pursued, and of lessons that would reshape how humanity thinks about state power and human rights. The turning point came not in Berlin, but in the frozen wasteland outside Stalingrad. When Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the German Sixth Army in February 1943, he surrendered more than soldiers, he shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. For the Gestapo, this military catastrophe translated into an operational nightmare. Resources that had once flowed freely towards surveillance and repression now had to be diverted to more pressing concerns. The organization that had prided itself on knowing everything about everyone found itself increasingly blind, its network of informants disrupted by bombing raids, evacuations, and the simple chaos of a nation under siege. Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo since 1939, faced an impossible task. Known as Gestapo Müller, to distinguish him from other officials sharing his common surname, he watched his carefully constructed machinery of terror begin to malfunction. Agents who had once tracked down resistance members with ruthless efficiency were now reassigned to investigate defeatism among German citizens, a task as endless as it was futile. The very population that had once feared the Gestapo's knock at the door was growing desperate enough to speak openly of defeat, and no amount of terror could silence millions of whispered doubts. By 1944, the situation had deteriorated further. The July 20 assassination attempt against Hitler, carried out by Wehrmacht officers including Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, sent shockwaves through the Nazi leadership. The Gestapo responded with characteristic brutality, arresting thousands in what became known as Operation Thunderstorm. Nearly 7,000 people were detained, and approximately 4,980 were executed in the aftermath. Yet this final spasm of violence revealed the organization's fundamental weakness. It had failed to detect a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the German military. The all-seeing eye had been blind to enemies within its own house. As Allied forces advanced from both east and west in early 1945, a different kind of operation began in Gestapo headquarters across Germany. The smell of burning paper filled offices from Berlin to Munich as officials frantically destroyed decades' worth of documentation. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who had led the Reich Main Security Office since Reinhard Heydrich's assassination in 1942, issued orders for the systematic destruction of records that could implicate the organization and its members in crimes against humanity. Filing cabinets that had once contained the fates of countless victims' arrest reports, interrogation transcripts, execution orders were fed into furnaces and bonfires. The destruction was thorough but incomplete. In their haste, Gestapo officials left behind fragments that would later prove crucial to prosecutors. In some cases, local commanders prioritized their own escape over complete document destruction. Others, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, quietly preserved records as potential bargaining chips. The result was a patchwork of evidence enough to prosecute some criminals, insufficient to identify all of them. This would haunt efforts at post-war justice for decades to come. When Heinrich Müller was last seen in Hitler's bunker on the 1st of May 1945, he vanished from history entirely. Despite numerous investigations, his fate remains unknown to this day. Some historians believe he died in Berlin, others suspect he escaped to South America or even defected to the Soviet Union. His disappearance symbolized a broader phenomenon, the melting away of Gestapo personnel into the chaos of post-war Germany. Many lower-ranking officials simply removed their insignia, destroyed their identification papers, and blended into the masses of refugees and displaced persons flooding across Europe. Not all escaped, however. When American forces captured Kaltenbrunner, hiding in a mountain cabin near Alt-Aussee, Austria, in May 1945, they secured one of the most significant defendants for the coming trials. At Nuremberg, where the International Military Tribunal convened in November 1945, the Gestapo would face not individual judgment, but collective condemnation. The Nuremberg trials represented something unprecedented in human history, an attempt to hold not just individuals, but entire organizations accountable for systematic crimes. Prosecutor Robert Jackson, in his opening statement, articulated the challenge facing the tribunal. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating, he declared, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. The Gestapo stood at the center of this reckoning. The evidence presented against the organization was overwhelming. Survivors testified about torture sessions in Gestapo cellars. Documents that had escaped destruction revealed the bureaucratic machinery of murder. The tribunal learned how the Gestapo had operated the Nacht- und Nebel program, through which thousands of resistance fighters across occupied Europe had simply disappeared into night and fog, their families never learning their fates. They heard how Gestapo officials had participated in the selection of concentration camp victims, how they had hunted Jews and political opponents with equal zeal, and how they had created a society in which neighbor informed upon neighbor. On the 1st of October 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdict. The Gestapo was declared a criminal organization, meaning that mere membership could constitute evidence of criminality in subsequent proceedings. The judgment noted that the organization had been used for purposes which were criminal under the Charter involving the persecution and extermination of the Jews, brutalities and killings in concentration camps, excesses in the administration of occupied territories, the administration of the slave labor program, and the mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war. Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking Gestapo official to face trial, was sentenced to death. He was hanged on the 16th of October 1946, along with 9 other convicted Nazi leaders. In subsequent proceedings known as the subsequent Nuremberg trials, additional Gestapo officials faced justice, though many others escaped prosecution entirely. The Cold War's onset meant that Western authorities increasingly prioritized anti-communism over Nazi hunting, and some former Gestapo members found themselves recruited by intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The impact of the Gestapo's legacy on German society proved profound and enduring. In the immediate post-war years, a collective silence descended over many communities. The denazification programs implemented by Allied occupation authorities revealed the extent of complicity. Countless ordinary Germans had served as Gestapo informants, had denounced neighbors, had participated in the system of terror either actively or through deliberate ignorance. Confronting this truth proved psychologically devastating for a nation attempting to rebuild. It was not until the 1960s that a new generation of Germans began demanding a fuller accounting. The Auschwitz trials held in Frankfurt between 1963 and 1965 forced the nation to confront the crimes of the Nazi era in unprecedented detail. Testimony about Gestapo involvement in deportations and camp selections shocked a public that had preferred to forget. Student movements of the late 1960s challenged their parents' generation. What did you know? What did you do? These questions, often directed at former Gestapo informants and collaborators, reshaped German political culture permanently. The lessons drawn from the Gestapo experience extended far beyond Germany's borders, influencing the very foundations of international human rights law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, explicitly prohibited arbitrary arrest, torture, and the denial of legal protections, all hallmarks of Gestapo methodology. Article 9's declaration that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile spoke directly to the experience of those who had vanished into Gestapo custody without trial or recourse. The European Convention on Human Rights, which entered into force in 1953, institutionalized protections against the kind of state terror the Gestapo had perfected. The prohibition against torture, the right to a fair trial, the protection against arbitrary detention, each of these fundamental rights emerged, at least in part, from the determination that what had happened under organizations like the Gestapo must never be permitted again. The establishment of the European Court of Human Rights created mechanisms for enforcement that the victims of Nazi terror had never possessed. Perhaps most significantly, the Gestapo's history has served as an enduring warning about the dangers of unchecked state surveillance and authoritarian policing. Scholars studying the organization have noted how it relied less on omniscient surveillance than on the willingness of ordinary citizens to denounce one another. Robert Gellertli's research revealed that the Gestapo was actually a relatively small organization, never more than 32,000 members policing a population of over 60 million that derived its power, primarily, from voluntary denunciations. This insight has proven particularly relevant in an age of digital surveillance, reminding us that technology alone does not create police states. Rather, it is the combination of technology with social atomization and political fear that enables totalitarian control. And as the echoes of jackboots fade into the ruins of 1945, the shadow of the Gestapo remains a chilling reminder of how fear can be weaponized and silence enforced. Behind closed doors, in interrogation rooms and midnight arrests, countless lives were reshaped or erased in the name of control. History leaves us with a warning carved in memory. As writer George Santayana famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And so we close this chapter not in darkness, but in vigilance, remembering the voices that were silenced and guarding the freedom that survived them. Goodbye.